Do you find yourself bored at work while eating your lunch?
Do you watch the clock waiting for work to be over?
As you're sitting in meetings, do you find your boss's voice sounding like a howling banshee?
Then don't wait another minute. Tune into the Paranormal Peeps podcast.
We are ready to entertain you.
Darkcast Network, indie pods with a dark side. Hello and welcome back to Fuck That. Before I get into the episode, I wanted to give a shout out to Rachel, who is the newest member of my Patreon. Also, I need to share this really bizarre fact that I learned yesterday, and if anybody knows the reasoning behind this, please tell me why, because I read a bunch of weird theories. Nobody could really explain why, but apparently some Mexican cartels are customizing the magazines of their guns with Lana Del Rey's face on them. She's a singer. And I need to know why, because it is the weirdest thing I've ever come across. I think maybe ever. So yeah, it blew my mind. I figured it would blow your minds as well. And if anybody knows why, let me know, because I really need to know the reason behind this. It's going to drive me insane. All right, let's jump into the episode. Frederick Valentich is an Australian pilot who disappeared during a training flight. Frederick has been missing for 45 years, 4 months, and 19 days, and his disappearance is considered to be Australia's most famous case of an alien abduction. Frederick was born on June 9th, 1958, and I couldn't find really anything on his mother, but his father, Guido, was heavily involved in his disappearance. But what I do know is that both of his parents were born in Italy, and they subsequently moved to Australia, which was where Frederick was born. Starting at a young age, Frederick was fixated on UFOs and the thought of an alien invasion. Who doesn't enjoy a good tall gray? Am I right? Those are my favorite aliens. But anyway, his father did disclose that Frederick's fascination was somewhat a concern and that he was sometimes preoccupied with the thought of what could happen if there ever was an alien invasion, which is valid. I've seen Mars Attacks. I've played Duke Nukem. I know how that goes, and I'm not here for it. Shortly before the flight where he would disappear, there are a lot of sources that say that Frederick had disclosed to some people that he had seen a UFO moving very quickly throughout the sky. I'm going to talk more about aliens later in the episode, but before you judge this guy and think he's crazy, honestly, there's a lot of people out there that believe in aliens and UFOs. So honestly, this really is not something far-fetched to believe in. What Frederick was most passionate about was flying and becoming a pilot. In fact, this is what he dedicated his life to. At the age of 20 in 1978, he applied to the Royal Australian Air Force twice, and he subsequently was denied, but he then ended up joining the Air Training Corps. I'm going to give a really brief overview of where he was at as a pilot prior to this flight where he disappeared, and then I'm going to go into it more in depth after the investigation, but just to give you a quick idea of where he was at as a pilot. At the time, he was studying part-time to become a commercial pilot, so the kind of pilot that will take you to Florida when you want to go on vacation. If that's where you want to take a vacation. There's a lot of other better places, but I'm not here to judge. Anyway, he also had a private pilot's license at the time with 150 flight hours, as well as his night rating. What I mean by that is he had a Class 4 instrument rating, which he earned on May 11th of 1978, but this allowed him to fly at night only VFR, not IFR. VFR means visual flight rules. It is also called VMC, so visual meteorological conditions. So that means that he was able to fly in conditions where there was adequate visibility at night. However, if the visibility was subpar, that would require a pilot to use IFR or instrument meteorological conditions. So he was not instrument rated to fly in conditions that required you to use only instruments because of the visibility. And that is a difficult certification to achieve. At the time, he was not pursuing an instrument rating. He was pursuing his commercial pilot license, his CPL, and he had a really hard time with these certification exams. Unfortunately, he failed all 5 of the CPL exams twice. And the month prior to his disappearance, he had failed 3 more CPL exams. According to the investigation conducted by the Australia Department of Transport, prior to Frederick's last flight, he told his family, some friends, and his girlfriend that he only had 1 subject left that he needed to pass in order to gain his CPL. This was unfortunately not true. He also told them that he was attending classes twice a week to help him study for his CPL, and his father, Guido, was helping him pay for his commercial license, but nobody knew what training organization he was taking those classes with. Frederick was also involved in some incidences while flying, which I will also elaborate on later when I get into the report. Saturday, October 21st, 1978 was a beautiful day, super sunny, barely any clouds, just a perfect day. Not the kind of day that you see in New England ever, by the way. Late afternoon, evening, Frederick traveled to the Moorabbin Airport, which is right outside of Melbourne, for a training flight that he had scheduled. And that airport is one of the largest aviation education facilities in the world. It has 15 flight schools with over 650 instructors. Frederick was well known at the airport, and he booked a Cessna 182 light aircraft, which is a 4-seater single-engine plane. The weather forecast was clear, and he filed a flight plan to King Island, which is one of the Tasmanian islands across the Bass Strait. The Bass Strait is a channel of seawater that is between the Australian coast of Victoria and the island state of Tasmania. And at this point, various bodies of water meet within the strait between the Tasman Sea's Pacific Ocean and the Indian Ocean, which creates strong currents and waves. I did look into the weather in this area. I also looked at the weather at altitude, and what's interesting is typically at altitude, the wind will be stronger, but at altitude, it's a lot less. But sometimes the weather in this area can be super unpredictable, especially with squalls and bad weather coming in. I'm going to talk about the weather that particular day in depth later on, but overall, the conditions that day on the ground, additionally at altitude for a flight, they were more than ideal conditions. With that being said, after Frederick's disappearance, the Bass Strait did get a moniker, which is the Bass Strait Triangle, because the currents can be really strong, the waves and the wind can be strong. There have been a decent amount of shipwrecks there. So once this happened, it got the nickname of the Bass Strait Triangle. But suffice it to say, the weather is much worse for people that are in the water on boats. Okay, so when pilots are flying, they typically try to reduce the time spent flying over water. You can typically land a plane in an emergency on land. Can't really do that over the water. So the typical flight plan to King Island from that airport was to fly along the coast, and I'll post photos of this on social media from the Department of Transport because they have a lot of nice images where they highlight the flight pattern. Anyway, so you fly along the coast to the western entrance to the strait by Cape Otway. After that, it's 50 miles or 85 kilometers across the strait, so over water, between Cape Otway to King Island. According to the investigation summary report, Frederick submitted a flight plan for a night VMC flight. So those are the conditions I had mentioned earlier, which he was certified for, from the airport to King Island and back. And he did this after he obtained a meteorologic briefing just around 5:23 p.m. The cruising altitude in his flight plan was below 5,000 feet, with estimated time intervals of 41 minutes during the first stretch of flight to Cape Otway, and from there to King Island, it would take an additional 28 minutes. So 69 minutes of flight time. Nice. Frederick did not arrange for aerodrome lighting, which is just airport lighting, to be illuminated for his arrival at King Island, and he advised the briefing officer and the operator's representative that he was traveling to King Island to pick up 3 friends, and he brought 4 life jackets with him on his flight. However, prior to his flight, Frederick told his family, girlfriend, and some friends a totally different story. He told them he was flying to King Island to bring back crayfish. At 6:10, the plane that he was flying was refueled to capacity with a departure time of exactly 6:19. After Frederick departed, he established 2-way radio communications with Melbourne Flight Service Unit. Frederick reported his arrival at Cape Otway exactly 41 minutes into his flight, which is exactly how long it was supposed to take, at 7 p.m. The next transmission that Melbourne FSU received from Frederick was received exactly 6 minutes and 14 seconds past 7 o'clock, and this was recorded. I am going to read the transcript starting with Frederick, and it alternates between him and FSU, so just know that it's Frederick, FSU, and on and on. There is one part where Frederick speaks twice, which I'll note, but just so I don't have to keep saying who's speaking, just know that that's the order of dialogue. Frederick radios in and says, "Melbourne, this is Delta Sierra Juliet," which is the call sign for that aircraft. And in small aircrafts, you'll see this on the tail of the plane. It'll say, in this case, DSJ. And that is how the pilot will address air traffic control, and air traffic control will address the pilot. Or in this case, it's the Melbourne Flight Service Unit. So anyway, Frederick radios in and says, "Melbourne, this is Delta Sierra Juliet. Is there any known traffic below 5,000? Delta Sierra Juliet, no known traffic. Delta Sierra Juliet, seems to be a large aircraft below 5,000. Delta Sierra Juliet, what type of aircraft is it? Delta Sierra Juliet, I cannot affirm. It is 4 bright, it seems to me like landing lights. Delta Sierra Juliet? Melbourne, this is Delta Sierra Juliet. The aircraft has just passed over me at least 1,000 feet above. Roger, and it is a large aircraft, confirm. Unknown, due to the speed it's traveling. Is there any Air Force aircraft in the vicinity? Delta Sierra Juliet, no known aircraft in the vicinity. Melbourne, it's approaching now from due east towards me. And then it says open microphone for 2 seconds, which essentially means that he's holding on to the button to communicate via radio, but he's not saying anything. And there's going to be a lot of this from here on out. Frederick then radios in again and says, Delta Sierra Juliet, it seems to me that he's playing some sort of game. He's flying over me 2-3 times at speeds I could not identify. Delta Sierra Juliet, Roger, what is your actual level? My level is 4,500, 4500. Delta Sierra Juliet, and confirm you cannot identify the aircraft? Affirmative. Delta Sierra Juliet, Roger, stand by. Melbourne, Delta Sierra Juliet, it's not an aircraft, it is open microphone for 2 seconds. Delta Sierra Juliet, Melbourne, can you describe the aircraft? Delta Sierra Juliet, as it's flying past, it's a long shape. Open microphone for 3 seconds. Cannot identify more than that as it has such speed. Open microphone for 3 seconds. Before me right now, Melbourne. Delta Sierra Juliet, Roger, and how large would the object be? Delta Sierra Juliet, it seems like it's stationary. What I'm doing right now is orbiting, which essentially means that he's just flying in a circle. And the thing is just orbiting on top of me. Also, it's got a green light and sort of metallic, like it's all shiny on the outside. Delta Sierra Juliet. Delta Sierra Juliet. Open microphone for 5 seconds. It's just vanished. Delta Sierra Juliet. Melbourne, would you know what kind of aircraft I've got? Is it a type military aircraft? Delta Sierra Juliet. Confirm the aircraft just vanished. Say again. Delta Sierra Juliet, is the aircraft still with you? Delta Sierra Juliet, it's open mic for 2 seconds. It's now approaching from the southwest. Frederick then says again, Delta Sierra Juliet, the engine is rough idling. I've got it set at 23, 24, and the thing is, to my understanding, rough idling is not a good thing. And what he means by I've got it set at 23, 24, he means 2300 to 2400 RPMs. Delta Sierra Juliet, Roger, what are your intentions? My intentions are to go to King Island. Melbourne, that strange aircraft is hovering on top of me again. Open microphone for 2 seconds. It is hovering and it's not an aircraft. The second that he reported that he had a rough running engine and his intention was still to continue his flight to King Island, the alert phase was declared, and the aerodrome emergency procedures were activated at King Island, and King Island Flight Service was recalled to duty. FSU called in Delta Sierra Juliet, and Frederick responded with Delta Sierra Juliet Melbourne with open microphone for 17 seconds, and that was the end of communication. There is no record of any further transmissions from Frederick's aircraft, and this exchange lasted for just under 6 minutes. The investigation into Frederick's disappearance was conducted by the Australian Department of Transport, took 4 years to complete, and it noted that the reason for the disappearance of the aircraft had not been determined. Frederick was listed as missing and presumed dead after a coronial inquiry. The alert phase of SAR, which is search and rescue procedures, was declared at 7:12, and at 7:33, when his aircraft did not arrive at King Island, the distress phase was declared and search action was commenced. A very intensive air, sea, and land search was continued until October 25th of 1978, 4 days later, but there was absolutely no trace of the aircraft found. It was through this investigation that they were able to determine that Frederick had told everybody at the airport that he was going to pick up friends from King Island, but this directly contradicted what he told his girlfriend and family, that he was going to pick up crayfish. What is strange is there was absolutely no evidence of any passengers at King Island waiting for him to pick them up. Additionally, he didn't have any orders for crayfish except for one, which was from a member of the Air Training Corps. But Frederick did not order crayfish from King Island before his flight, and apparently, during his flight, there were no crayfish available at King Island. For those of you in the United States that are wondering what the fuck a crayfish is, I too was wondering that. They are crawdads. I'm sure you all know what that is. Crawfish, crawdad boil, you know? When they just dump them on the table and shit. A crawdad boil, that's what I'm talking about. So he didn't have a crayfish order in for King Island, and he didn't have any homies that he was allegedly supposed to pick up at King Island, which is very strange. It gets weirder. Frederick told his girlfriend that he would meet her at 7:30 that evening, which obviously would have been impossible. He was still flying to King Island at that point in time. He was chatting with FSU at 7:12, and then he would have had a 69-minute flight back, so that would have been impossible, and he was aware of that because this was not his first flight to King Island. Even stranger, he did tell his father that he would be home after his flight that evening. I mentioned earlier that in his flight plan, Frederick did not request aerodrome lighting, which I initially didn't find to be strange. But as I was reading through the Department of Transport's report, They noted that the King Island Flight Services Unit was closed, which Frederick was aware of. So this meant that there would be no other lighting and nobody that he would be able to communicate with on King Island. And they stated, quote, "It seems possible that he may not have had any intention of proceeding to King Island." The report continued, quote, "His girlfriend has stated that he has perspired profusely and his voice changed in any unexpected or out of the ordinary situation. It was particularly noticed while monitoring the recorded communications containing his detailed description of the other vehicle's maneuvers that his voice remained matter-of-fact and completely normal. If it had been the pilot's intention to disappear, a number of directions of travel were open to him to maintain communication for the period he did while operating below 5,000 feet. However, it is unlikely that such a document would have been available to him, and his possible tracking directions would be listed to known coverage areas." This is the part that I found to be the most interesting. Quote, "Had the flight proceeded as planned and the aircraft did crash into the sea, it is most probable that wreckage would have been sighted. The aircraft disappeared without trace and no wreckage was located or information received concerning the whereabouts of the aircraft and its occupant. It therefore is not possible to determine the cause of the disappearance, but it seems likely that the aircraft did not crash in the sea between Cape Otway and King Island." I want to continue to read from the report because I think it has a lot of really good information, and this is part of the investigator's report, or note rather. So it says, "Notes of a conversation with the OIC," which I'm assuming is the officer in charge of King Island, on October 24th of 78, Brian Jones. He was on duty from 0800 to 1500 on Saturday, which is 8 to 3. At 1500, he put through a closing request to MLFS, which is the flight service, stating lights out as no planned flights due and no request for lights. He was pulled out of the golf club by Melbourne about 19:15, so 7:15, after the aircraft had reported engine problems. He put on the airfield lights at 19:35, so 7:35. At the same time, his assistant had just arrived to also put the lights on for a departing Cessna, which had been held up for passengers, and this is again on King Island. That same Cessna that was held up on King Island was immediately used for a quick search around the island with the assistant as an observer from 8 o'clock to 8:25. Nothing sighted. Weather absolutely clear with unlimited visibility. There was another plane that arrived at 1800 hours, which is 6 o'clock, with a band that was due to depart around 3 o'clock the next morning. They have an agent who has a key for the lights on that island. Again, this was an additional plane that was used for a quick search at 1,000 feet, so super low altitude at 8 o'clock to 8:55, with Brian Jones, who was the officer in charge, as an observer. He noted that you could see the Cape Otway lights, which is where the last transmission came in. That is that one last point that you fly to before you're flying directly over the strait to King Island. And he noted that you could see the Cape Otway lights flashing from the lighthouse as well as all of the island lights. Excellent visibility with a clear sky. No clouds, very starry. Many fishing boats around the island had their lights on and could be seen for miles. Additionally, the officer in charge spoke to the cray fishermen, and none were ordered for that night, they had confirmed. In fact, they had sold out in the afternoon and didn't have any left. He noted that the pilot had not booked into the hotel, and they do not recognize the name of the pilot, Frederick, but the aircraft had been down to King Island before, so it was something that the aircraft could handle. During the course of the search into Frederick's disappearance, there were two big issues that were noted in the investigation. And it is written in a way that it is unclear and vague, so bear with me. The first states that search time was lost by the Optimum aircraft. I'm assuming what they mean by that is the search plane, but again, it doesn't really say. Then it says, in directing a surface vessel, which I'm assuming is a boat, to the position of a possible oil slick and debris for retrieval. The way this reads to me is that search time was lost because this search for the oil slick and debris was happening at the same time that all of this was going down, which implies that it's probably not related, but I don't know. It is very unclear. It then states that the second problem is when the light aircraft without integral navigation systems found possible debris out of sight of land, they had to climb to a fixed position, and when they did that, they lost sight of said debris. So again, two very unclear statements. They do not state yes or no, this debris could be related, but who knows? The way it reads to me is that the search was going on with the search plane while all of this was going on. It was probably not related, but I could be wrong. And that the second debris that they mentioned is a different debris site. Anyway, it's confusing. Let's move on. On October 25th, which is the following day, Frederick's father, Guido, visited the office that was conducting the investigation for the purpose of hearing the tape recording that he made before his disappearance. And they noted certain statements that he made during that conversation. At the time of his disappearance, Frederick was working for an army disposals firm. And Guido was under the impression that he was attending lectures for his CPL at an airport on Tuesday nights from 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock on Saturday afternoons. And by an airport, I mean Moorabbin, so the airport that he flew out of. What was odd is that he did not know the organization, which I mentioned earlier. Nobody knew the organization, nor did anybody know the alleged lecturer. His father went on to state that there were no problems at home. Frederick didn't have any financial issues. He very much wanted a career in aviation, and he was really excited about eventually being able to join the Royal Australian Air Force. What I thought was most important of this conversation was that he stated that Frederick was a firm believer in UFOs. He had saved articles and information on UFOs and read Chariot of the Gods as well as other books. He went to see movies on the subject, and this interest started when he was at school about 6 years ago, so when he was 14. And his belief was strengthened recently when he was allegedly allowed to see the Royal Australian Air Force's confidential files on UFOs. And apparently he wouldn't discuss these details with his family as they were confidential. There's nothing to suggest that this actually happened. So this is all just what his father is stating based on dialogue with Frederick. He then further states that Frederick's mother saw a UFO one night. She called Frederick and he apparently saw it too. It was a large light, 10 times larger than a star. It was stationary for a while and then it moved off at a great speed. He stated that this happened to Frederick about 8 months ago, so 8 months prior to his disappearance. His father eventually became convinced that UFOs existed. So this entire family, Frederick did have sisters, but his father, his mother, and him firmly believed in aliens and the existence of them, as well as UFOs. His father further stated that Frederick was worried about attack from UFOs and what they could do, but he had told them that there was nothing that they could do, therefore there's no point in worrying about it. He then stated that he's unsure about what him and his girlfriend had planned that night. He knew that Fred was going to be home and thought something about his girlfriend's statement was fishy. His girlfriend stated that they had plans. There's really nothing to suggest that she had anything to do with anything. So I think at this point, it's the day after. It's just a grieving father trying to rationalize things. One of the components of this investigation was an official pilot investigation in which they conducted a thorough background and history of Frederick. I'm going to read through a lot of it, and there's going to be some overwhelmingly negative aspects of his career, especially in piloting. And I just want to say that I'm not going over that to make Frederick look bad in any way, but I think it's a critical piece to the investigation. In high school, he had some difficulties. He fell below average in geography, English, science, and graphics, which I feel like graphics is fucking irrelevant. Who gives a shit? And he failed math A and B. This was in 1974. In 1976, he applied to the Royal Australian Air Force, and the test results were very low scores, indicative of low IQ, fit for unskilled work only. In 1977, he enrolled in RMIT, which is the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, but he subsequently withdrew in July. He had his student pilot license issued on February 24th of 1977. It says solo June, so I'm assuming that he was able to fly solo in June of 1977, but it doesn't state any further. It states that he passed the basic aeronautical knowledge on his third attempt on August 11th of 1977. He passed the restricted private pilot at his second attempt in September. His restricted PPL, so private pilot license, was issued September 23rd of 1977 with 57 flying hours. It's really impressive that he accomplished 100 flying hours in a year, by the way. That is a lot. It then discusses his PPL theory exams. So he passed his nav exams at his second attempt. He passed his aircraft performance and operations exam at his fifth attempt, and his air legislation he passed at his third attempt. Now, I know that all of this can look overwhelmingly negative, but at the end of the day, he ended up passing these exams. It may have taken him more than one attempt, but he passed. And I think that shows, honestly, tact and dedication on his part. Other points that they note in this is that his pilot logbook was not found, but it is possible that he had that with him on his flight. They stated that at the time of his disappearance, he was working as a shop assistant, but he devoted pretty much all of his energy into flying. As a boy, he had been an Air Training Corps cadet. In 1977, after he started flying, he returned to the Corps as an unpaid civilian helper. He was later taken on with the rank of airman. He was well thought of by friends and acquaintances. He was determined to succeed as a pilot. And as I had mentioned, unfortunately, this was a lie, but he had told everybody that he passed some CPL theory exams. He failed every single one. But this could have been a shame thing. This could have been a shame response. So, for example, there was one person that they interviewed that was an instructor that failed him his first time unrestricted, but he called him an average pilot. He said it was okay on instruments, never mentioned UFOs. In another interview, however, somebody said that he was a sensible pilot. He didn't drink, he didn't do drugs, no mention of UFOs. Another person called him quiet, sincere, sensible, didn't drink, didn't smoke. Another instructor called him an average pilot. So even given his background with the trouble he got into prior to taking this last flight where he disappeared and failing his exams before he subsequently passed, there were multiple people interviewed that said he was an okay pilot, but nobody said he was a bad pilot or that he had no business to fly planes. Now I want to get into in-depth the meteorologic conditions according to the Bureau of Meteorology. And today I learned what the fuck Zulu time is, which is apparently something that they use for flying. Why they don't just use regular fucking time is beyond me, but 0800, when I read this document, is 6 p.m. in Australia, Zulu time. So at 0800 on October 21st of 1978, again 6 p.m., conditions were perfect for night flying. Although a trace of stratocumulus at 5,000 to 7,000 feet and scattered cirrus at 30,000 feet were reported, no cloud was detectable between the Victorian Ranges and the northern Tasmania coast on the infrared satellite pictures at 0600 and 0900. That's 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. There was no turbulence and visibility was excellent. An airborne aircraft over King Island at 8 o'clock that evening, which would have been way after this last transmission came in, could clearly see the light from the Cape Otway lighthouse. So visibility was ideal. You could see the lighthouse from Cape Otway, from King Island, which when he radioed in, he was right after Cape Otway. Who knows how far he made it, but vice versa. And then again, there were the fishing boats that they stated during the search and rescue. They could see the lights from the fishing boats in the air. So suffice it to say that this was the perfect flight condition and that there was nothing weather-wise that should have impacted Frederick's flight. After Frederick's disappearance, particularly when people found out that he was implying that there was a UFO circling him, the media went absolutely insane and really just perpetuated the idea that a UFO had abducted Frederick. It was a complete media circus, totally honing in on this one probability and completely ignoring any other possibility of what happened to Frederick. As I had mentioned earlier, Frederick and his family believed in aliens and the existence of UFOs. So keep that in mind when I read the following. According to the Department of Transport's investigative report, quote, Frederick's father was convinced and remains so, according to subsequent media publicity, that his son was captured by a UFO and that he would be returned when they had finished investigating him. Frederick showed a great interest in UFOs and had a collection of books, articles, and clippings on the subject, but father did not think that his son was convinced of their existence as he himself was. In an interview with The Age, which is a Melbourne-based paper, his father stated, quote, I'd rather it was a UFO than a plane crash. And I really want to drive the point home that in extreme grief like this, it is so common for people to believe something that everybody else might perceive as far-fetched. To me, this seems like something that would be easier to digest than his son dying in a plane crash because it leaves it open that when they're done investigating him, he could return. So I get it. In extreme grief like this, a lot of people will believe something that's easier. So now I want to jump into theories, and I want to start with aliens. When I say that, I don't know if any of you have seen that meme. It's like this guy with a little bit of a goatee and he has crazy hair and he's got his hands like next to his head. I think it's from the History Channel and it just says aliens. I gotta post it on social media. But every time I say that, I just think of this guy from the History Channel with just disheveled hair and it just says aliens. Anyway, but what I thought was really interesting is that after his disappearance, so many people suddenly started spotting UFOs. I'm going to read through two different reports in this investigation from the Department of Transport where they received phone calls from people that swore that they saw UFOs, which I think is really interesting, honestly, especially because one of them comes from a very credible source. At approximately 1800 hours on October 22nd, 1978, so that's 6 p.m. the next day, I received a telephone call at my home front. I'm going to leave the person's name out of it. You can look up this investigative report online, but I don't want to name anybody. So this man stated that he was a responsible person, an officer in the Royal Australian Air Force Reserve, and he did not wish to create the opinion that he was a nut. I respect that. Lead off with that. So this guy stated that at around 6:55 on the previous night, so when Frederick was in his flight that evening, he was traveling from Mount Waverley in a southerly direction along Huntingdale Road. Mount Waverley is a suburb in Melbourne, so super close. He further states that he observed a shower of very bright metallic scintillations, which I'm not going to lie, that's a new word for me. Outside of physics, so I know that word in the context of physics, but this doesn't apply. So outside of physics, when we're not talking about light and photons, it's just like flashing beams of light. So picture, the way I understand it, you're wearing a diamond ring, you got your windows open, and the light kind of hits the diamond, and it causes like those lights to kind of beam off of it. And that is what scintillation means outside of physics. So he sees these weird lights in the sky at an angle of about 45 degrees. How the fuck this dude is able to determine that is beyond me, but I digress. But he states at an angle of about 45 degrees from the horizontal, 1.5 degrees of are in vertical plane and 1 degree are in the lateral plane. This is like so precise. I don't know if the dude had like a really intense protractor in the trunk of his car, but this is what it says from the report. So apparently it was followed by a dark trail moving from south to north. At first, he thought it to be a meteor shower, but apparently he then thought it was a UFO sighting. Then a man named John Snow, he was driving his car on Saturday night, the same night at around 11:45, when his 11-year-old son saw a greenish-white light of some length flash quite fast across the sky to the south. But John Snow himself, nor anybody else in his family, had saw the light, just his 11-year-old son. 5 years after Frederick's disappearance, an engine cowl flap was found washed ashore on Flinders Island, which is located just east of King Island. In July of 1983, the Bureau of Air Safety Investigation asked the Royal Australian Navy Research Lab about the likelihood that this cowl flap could have traveled to the position it ended up in from the region where Frederick's aircraft had disappeared. And they noted that, quote, the part has been identified as coming from a Cessna 182 aircraft between a certain range of serial numbers, end quote. But these serial numbers did include the aircraft that Frederick was flying in at the time of his disappearance. So super vague, but not ruling out the fact that it could have come from his plane. In 2013, a retired United States Air Force pilot and astronomer, really weird combo, but I digress, co-authored an article for the Skeptical Inquirer, which is subtitled The Magazine for Science and Reason. Take it for what it's worth and how you will. But according to the article, quote, as it happens, a computer search of the sky for the day, time, and place of Valentich's flight reveals that the 4 points of bright light he would almost certainly have seen were the following: Venus, which was at its very brightest, Mars, Mercury, and the bright star Antares. These 4 lights would have represented a diamond shape, given the well-known tendencies of viewers to connect the dots, and so could well have been perceived as an aircraft or UFO. In fact, the striking conjunction was shaped as a vertically elongated diamond, thus explaining Valentich's saying of the UFO that it's a long shape. As to the UFO's other characteristics, the metallic or shiny appearance could have been due to the power of suggestion alone. Having connected the dots, Valentich would likely have gone on to fill in the areas as solid, even metallic. We must remember that Valentich's impressions are those of someone who is confused about what he was seeing. The green light could have been part of this confusion also. Remember, Valentich's first description of the UFO involved only 4 bright white lights. He made no mention at the time of a green one. It could actually have been nothing more than the Cessna's own navigation lights on the right wingtip. That green light, or its reflection on the windshield, could easily have been superimposed onto the UFO sighting, end quote. Other theories suggested that Frederick staged his own disappearance, or that he possibly became disoriented and began flying upside down or inverted. If this did actually happen, this would allow him to see his aircraft's lights reflecting off of the water. But the problem is, with the specific model Cessna that he was in, it would not have allowed him to fly inverted for a long time because the fuel system that it had was a gravity feed fuel system. So if it was inverted, that gravity would not be feeding the fuel system. Therefore, the engine would have cut off not long after the plane inverted. So who knows? It's plausible, but whether it's probable or not is beyond me. Another theory is that Frederick committed suicide, but a lot of people believe that based on interviews with several people that knew him, as well as doctors, that this was a less plausible theory. At the end of the day, we just don't know what happened, and I'm not sure that we ever will. Frederick's disappearance would not be the last. A few years later, in 1981, another aircraft disappeared without a trace in the forests of New South Wales. To this day, no trace of the aircraft or its occupants have been found. However, there are a lot of other factors that go into play with that disappearance regarding freezing over and weird temperature conditions, but a lot of people like to link the two, so I figured I would mention it as well. Frederick Valentich's disappearance is the perfect mixture of mystery, intrigue, and a dash of, I want to believe. The theories are all over the place, from a simple case of pilot error to him skipping town to start his new life, maybe as a crayfish salesman. His story is frustrating, fascinating, and it makes you want to flip the table and declare UFOs did it. But here's the thing. We're probably never going to know what really happened to Frederick. Frederick's story is one that over decades has invited speculation, conversation, and maybe a little bit of hope and intrigue that there's more out there than we can see from the little planet that we call home. So whether you're a skeptic with your feet firmly on the ground or a believer with your eyes on the stars, the story of Frederick Valentich is a wild ride without a clear destination. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly how it should be. After all, his father stated that he'd rather believe it was a UFO than a plane crash. So maybe we should just keep it that way. If you want more of me and my pod, F That Pod on Patreon. For every single episode, I archive a lot of my old episodes, so you get every single episode there. I release them early and ad-free, 0 ads. Baby girl's gotta make money, but there's no ads on Patreon. If you also liked what you heard, please like, review, subscribe. You can find me on all social media at fthatpod except for Instagram, fthat_pod. I'm on YouTube, fthatpod, and the website is fthatpod.com. Love you, bye.